Today I'm going to be talking about the Wild Wild West. First, the frontier. The frontier was an imaginary line that separated settled areas from the wilderness. By 1850, only land west of the Mississippi River to California/Oregon was unsettled. The land seemed dry and unfarmable to Easterners. The land consisted of the Great Plains and the desert known as the Great Basin. Native Americans actually lived in the unsettled lands due to the removal in 1830s. They saw the land as sacred since it provided them means of life, and they used buffaloes for shelter, food, clothing, basically everything. Buffaloes were essential to Native American life. And post 1850s, Easterners actually started to move into the western region, which we'll talk about in the next slide. Now, what were the reasons for the movement into the west? Number one was mining. News of gold in the Rockies in 1859 and many more discoveries of valuable metals led to many people moving into the West and establishing mining towns. The second reason was cattle farming in the 1860s and 1870s. Lots of land in the Great Plains equals a lot of open grazing land, which equals a lot of profit for aspiring cattle farmers. And our third reason was farming. The Homestead Act in 1862 led to many Easterners moving to the West and trying out their luck at farming. Now, there was some violence in the West, however, it was not as violent as it was shown in the movies. One instance of violence was when farmers started to use barbed wire for fencing, which angered the cattle owners, which led to some gunfights. But by the 1880s, cattle owners had conceded and there was basically no more quote unquote open grazing land. So they started to fence in their own private grazing land. There was also some vigilantes who carried out their own punishment toward criminals, and this happens sometimes without trial, which is pretty cool. The frontier and industrialization. Railroad companies were eager for Western business, which meant that they sold land grants from the government to settlers for really cheap. The railroads were actually really crucial for Texas cattle drivers, since the railroads were the connecting link to the markets of the East. Basically, no railroads meant no profit. There was some new technology due to industrialization. Number one, the windmill, which provided power needed to pump underground water. Then we have barbed wire, which was invented in 1874, which enabled fences to be built without wood. And finally, we have steel plows, which allowed for farmers to cut into the hard soil of the Great Plains. How was life on the frontier? Life was really hard for the first frontier people. There was not many trees for wood, not much rainfall, not much social life due to the great distance between neighbors, and there was a lot of dust. Life for women was especially hard, since they had to balance a lot of chores and take care of their whole family. However, they were the civilizing force in the West and made more settled/peaceful communities. Women in the West actually got the right to vote before women in the East, and men realized the sacrifices that women made for frontier life. By 1890, the U.S. Bureau of Census declared that the frontier ceased to exist. Frederick Turner actually observed that the frontier was more democratic than the settled areas and provided new economic opportunities. He saw that the frontier people viewed each other based on character rather than social rank, and that the frontier allowed for a new life for Easterners. So, Turner argued that the frontier served America as a democratizing force and as an economic outlet. However, some scholars disagreed and argued that the British influence in colonial times was much more influential to American democracy, and that the West was not an economic outlet due to the sheer cost for the trip westward. Native Americans, remember, were pushed westward during the 1830s due to Jackson. However, the Homestead Act and new railroad growth spurred settlers to move west and take over Indian land. Treaties that promised right to land for the Native Americans were broken during the 1850s through the 1890s, and settlers took over Native American land with the support of the U.S. military. By 1890, Native Americans were placed in reservations, and buffaloes, which were essential to Native American life, were hunted and near extinction. The Native Americans did try to fight back and run away, but were always captured or defeated. Legislating Native American life, reservation lands were barren and poorly suited for life. The Native Americans lived in poverty with a sense of hopelessness, and many agents of reservations also pocketed welfare. In the 1880s, Americans realized how unfair their treatment of Native Americans were, which led to the Dawes Act of 1887. This act offered 160 acres of land to the Native Americans. Essentially, the government wanted to turn Native Americans into farmers. However, the Native Americans didn't adapt well and didn't really want to become farmers. So the Native Americans were still poor. And I don't really know how to exactly pronounce the name of the school. I'm going to guess Carlisle School in 1879 through 1918. This was a school that whitewashed Native American culture, which included changing names, religion, etc. for Native American children. And this school served as a model for other schools for assimilation of American culture. Uh, in 1929, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, which granted all Indians citizenship, and in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, which stated that Native Americans